This is the long note, one of two note types in Mania. There's the head, the body, and the tail, and they're scored differently depending on what scoring system you're playing on. These are usually mapped against long sustained sounds within the music, but can be used in various ways. This video will essentially serve as a showcase of the basic ways long notes are used within maps. The most common way you'll see long notes used are against vocals. Now, because this is YouTube and we have to avoid this thing, let's find another song that has more sustained sounds in general. Notice the string instrument in the background. We can see how it's being sustained over a number of measures, but hold on a second, songs aren't exactly one-dimensional, and unless you're mapping a 1-star, you'd want more notes going on within your map. This is when layering comes in. Layering is essentially mapping and representing the multiple different sounds going on within a song at the same time. This is mostly referred to when mapping long notes, but singles can also have layering. Looking at this example, we can have chords and single notes mapped to the drum sounds of the map while the long note is being continued in the background. A thing I like to do is downsize the density. So for instance, if I'm mapping 3 note chords to this sound, and 2 note chords to this sound, I would simply minimize that to 2 and 1. I didn't do it in this specific case because for higher key counts, you kind of have more wiggle room for this sort of thing, and with lower BPM songs, you can afford to be more dense without compromising playability so much. As mentioned in a previous mapping video, because these are mapped to sustained notes in the music, you can use pitch relevance to guide your object placements within the map. In this map, I'm not really doing that, as I'm mostly focusing on creating an interesting structure, but if you're struggling about object placement, you can use the music itself to guide you. When it comes time to end the long note, the placement of the adjacent notes and the following long note can affect playability greatly, depending on which column you choose. For 4K, this isn't exactly too much of an issue, as each finger is basically the same strength, though some players might struggle with this pattern more than this one. In 10K, you almost never want to have a pattern like this in your map, unless you're intentionally trying to make something uncomfortable. Even though this arrangement might be okay with most players, moving the single note just one beat later increases the perceived difficulty by a lot, and you're having to do 2 really complex movements at the same time with your weakest fingers. If you have long note releases like this where they're staggered, it can be helpful to have some sort of visual representation of that within your map, as well as making sure it fits well with the song. Just swapping these 2 long note positions creates a bracket movement for this pattern, which isn't exactly what I was intending. But sometimes you'll want more complex release timings if you're, say, layering different parts of the music to all use long notes. Sometimes you can have releases that happen before the next 1/2 or 1/1 tick mark. Doing this allows you to put more emphasis on the following beat, as well as letting you use however many columns freely. Because it's tricky to time the release and press of the notes within the small window of time, you should only do this on specific parts of the song that you're really trying to emphasize. If you're really daring, you can have multiple long notes layered, all with different release timings and lengths. But make sure you're consistent about which sounds get mapped to what long notes, and don't be as messy as this. Lastly, I want to talk about long note usage specifically within lower difficulty maps. The ranking criteria already provides an extensive list of guidelines on how to use long notes within these difficulties, so if you're really struggling with these, you should probably take a look at it. General tips like no 1/4 long notes, no layering 1/4 during a long note, and no 1/4 shielding are all pretty consistent throughout a lot of players' maps, so you should really become accustomed to this. One thing you can use long notes for is representing 1/4 string patterns within maps, as these are generally not allowed within lower difficulties. Honestly, it would be quite funny to see something like this within a high star map, as it technically would still be correct. As mentioned earlier, pinky and ring finger releases like this can be very tricky for newer players, so pay attention to the exact movements that would have to be executed when playing a long note. Even something as simple as this creates a weird and awkward clawing motion to move the middle finger, so if you're doing some layering and higher key counts, it's generally recommended to give a lot of distance from the long note, or to go on the opposite hand entirely. And when it comes time to release a long note, most of these are generally okay, but when you're releasing with chords on the same hand, you can sometimes create awkward bracket movements or weird spacing that's not recommended for lesser experienced players. So be aware of that. I think that's all the basics of long notes that newer mappers might want to know. Obviously, long note maps and layering can get far more intricate and difficult the higher you go, but maybe that can be a topic for another video. So to wrap things up, long notes are best used for sustained sounds within music, such as vocals or background chords. You have the option to layer in additional notes for other sounds going on in the music, like the drums and bass. The columns that you choose for long notes and the adjacent release notes can greatly affect the complexity, and long note usage within lower star maps can represent the song in a minimized way, but also brings the possibility of introducing awkward patterns or breaking the RC guidelines. If you have any additional questions, thoughts, or future mapping topics that I should cover, please leave a comment below.